Well, first of all, I was hoping I could get a presidency. At the time that I came here, there were about 31 or 3,200 colleges, accredited colleges in the country. So that there weren't that many slots opening every year. And I had gone through the typical ladder at NAU of department chair to dean to vice president. And the next step is a presidency. And that was not going to happen at NAU. They had a young and successful president there. So a friend of mine who was a president up in Colorado gave me a call and he said, "Do you know about the University of San Diego?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, they have an opening there for a president." And I did follow up with that and sent a letter in, got information back to a selection committee here, which was headed by Father Shipley. And from that point on, it was a matter of the routine references and then visits, and all of that occurred over a period of several months. USD was in the process of completing a merger. It had begun before I arrived, but my first responsibility was to complete that merger, to get an agreement between the College for Men, which was owned and operated by the diocese and law school, and the College for Women, which was owned and operated by the Religious of the Sacred Heart. So the merger had to be completed, and that was my first urgent task. The second most important thing for the 5-year period that followed was finances. The university had operated at deficits for a number of years, and the bishop had made it very clear that that could not continue. So it was left up to me and the staff that we put together to see that that deficit type of operation ceased. I'll remember that at the time of merger, the board of the College for Women and the board from the College for Men were to have a joint meeting. This was in the month of June. And the purpose of this, they had agreed with the documents that had been presented to them. The separate boards had said, yes, we will merge. The purpose of this meeting specifically was to sign off on the merger. We met in one of the rooms in the College for Women, and the College for Women board was all there assembled, and only 3 members from the College for Men: the bishop and a couple of the priests. And Sister Dans, who was the then outgoing president of the College for Women, got a big kick out of the idea that we're going to have a marriage here, but the groom didn't show up. Well, obviously they very quickly got on the telephone, and the right people were here within a short time. And that was at that meeting that the merger was officially signed, and we became the University of San Diego. Early on at USD, we were, if you'll remember, we were just coming out of the 1960s. And the 1960s was characterized by campus unrest. If anything, students unhappy with the way the Vietnam War was going and ended. There was a great difference in the atmosphere of college campuses during that period of time. Then as we grew out of that era, the students came back to being happy to be away from home, to be able to make their own decisions, to enjoy the freedom of campus life. And as that time of uncertainty passed, the university became much more like a traditional university, in not only in its administrative composition and curriculum composition, but in the campus milieu. It simply became more like college life, which is pretty neat life when you think about it. When I arrived on campus, there were still 2 distinct campuses. And the first task was, of course, to merge those so that there would be one set of biology labs and one library, and that took some additional capital to bring that about. Not a lot, but some. And then the next thing was the realization that if the university were going to survive, it would have to grow. That there are different economic models for university, and the university's enrollment was just simply too small to be able to predict much of a length of tenure. So we thought through what that would mean. We set goals for enrollment increases in the combined institution, and that meant several new things. One, we had created a school of business, we had created a school of nursing, and both of those require separate facilities. We had hoped that we could do some continuing education to kind of shore up those periods of time when campus was not in regular session. And we sort of penciled all of that out and saw that maybe in the next, from the beginning for the next 5 years, a few minimal structures. And then for the next 5 years, well, a few more structures. All of that ended up initially with $10 million for the first 5, and another $50 million for the next 10, and another $50 million beyond that. And that ended up with a new college for business building, a new nursing school, a new law library, actually not a new law library, but a redesign of the old one, and an expansion of the original law school for classroom facilities and a mock courtroom. So all of those things had to be thought through. We began a fundraising program, and the first step of that was to get a board of directors, a board of trustees, who would understand that and who would hopefully be able to help contribute to the financial goals that we had established. And we were very fortunate. We had some terrific people. And I have to say very quickly, all of that effort was aided just dramatically by the help of the bishop, who has an automatic drawing power when it comes to inviting people to do something. It's pretty hard to say no to the bishop. So we had people like Helen Copley, Ernie Hahn, George Pardee, and many others, Bruce Hazard. All were local people who were well known, many very wealthy in their own rights, and they did come through, not only in sharing their own wealth with us, but identifying other people who would share their wealth with us. And we set goals, we achieved those goals, we built the buildings that at that point we thought we had to have, and we very soon filled them up. And so accordingly, we made the plan and we followed through with it. One of the first steps that I had to ponder was, what does it really mean to be a Catholic university? Obviously it means symbolism, crosses, crucifixes, and we were well blessed with that. We had lots of indication that something Christian was going on up here. But as I thought about it, as I talked to people, and I have to add that I'm a convert to Catholicism, so I did not have the traditional background that most Catholic people have, at least most Catholics at that time. So I talked with people, and the thing that I began to realize was that it has to do with the way people are treated, excuse me, that the respect for human dignity is the essence of Christ's message, and that if we were to manifest that in the way we behaved up here, we would be, in my view, meeting the goals of a Catholic institution. In addition to offering the sacraments, in addition to having Mass, in addition to doing all of the things that are traditional in a parish. So we use the term value orientation to try to say that's what we mean by a respect for human dignity. And the values were personal values, honesty, integrity, loyalty, truth-telling. They were social values like peace and justice, and transcendental values, a faith, a belief in God, a belief in those things which become manifest through the practice of a religion. That was part of my own formation, I have to add. I did not have that background, and it came to be a realization the longer I stayed here, that's not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. And that's what we tried to do. One of the advantages I have is that I was a teacher, first high school teacher, then a college teacher, and I loved it. I loved it because I like teaching. I like the response that you get from students as they learn. But I happen to like students. The college-age student, I think, can be an invigorating group of people. Coming to USD, there was no exception to that. I enjoyed them. I wasn't teaching. I tried teaching for one course for one semester, and that and trying to follow a schedule that the president has to follow didn't work well. So I gave teaching up, but I didn't want to give students up. So Marge and I would have students to our home. We had them there for dinner on occasion. I had them in my office here on occasion. Later on in my tenure in San Diego, I had a sailboat, and John Trifoletti, who was on our staff at that time, would recruit some students to go sailing. And that was fascinating because I got the lowdown on what was going on campus in a way that I would never have done in the formality of my office. And it was fun. And I got to know them, and it was a great experience for me. I hope it was for them. But I think that one of the things that is important for anyone in college work is to like the age group. And if you don't like that, then get out of it. Do something else. I taught high school for a while, and I learned very quickly I didn't particularly like the age group. It requires a lot of disciplining, and that wasn't particularly enjoyable. USD's faculty, when I arrived, were still separate faculties. They had merged departments. In fact, there were, as I remember, 30-some departments, which administratively was way too many, way too many. So I decided that in addition to organizing or reorganizing the institution, I ought to study the faculty and see just where we were with all of that. The first thing I learned was that the faculty in the undergraduate and the university non-law faculty were terribly underpaid. We were operating the institution, in my view, on the backs of the faculty, and I didn't think that was appropriate at all. So we made an effort, a concerted effort with the board that we would begin raising those salaries for two reasons. One is because they were underpaid, as I saw it. And there's good evidence of that. That's not a hard thing to learn. But secondly, if we wanted to continue attracting a faculty with the growth of the institution, you can't offer subnormal salaries.
Yeah.
And in order to get a good faculty, you have to pay a good faculty. The law school had pretty well done that. They had managed their own. And there was a period of 3 years when we raised the undergraduate faculty but held the law faculty salaries pretty much constant. That wasn't very popular, particularly with the law faculty, but they understood. And as soon as we'd gotten through the 3-year period, we went back to encouraging growth financially for that faculty as well. Since that time, we really had a lot of success in getting those salaries up to something that was at least on the median, if not above. One of the chief responsibilities of a college president is to organize the institution as he or she sees appropriate. And that's a function of how you see your mission, of who are the talented people that are available. So in organizing it, I selected people, primarily a couple who were already here, Sister Sally Fury, who became the academic vice president. The finance vice president was Jack Boyce, who did not have a college experience background, but had a lot of financial background and construction background. Tom Burke, who had a world of experience in working with student affairs, and looking at the functional areas of a college, I chose those as being the working team. Then there was one other one that remained open for a while, and it was in fundraising because I wasn't quite sure where we were going to go with that or how. But we eventually did, and we hired a professional from another institution. His name was Gil Brown, and Gil ran the fundraising apparatus for a number of years before he retired. So it's a matter of how do you see the functions within the organization, and where lies the talent to head those various functions. One of the other responsibilities of a college president is to try to put the best foot forward as far as the institution is concerned, including not only what kind of an institution is and what it's attempting to achieve, but also simply communicating the fact that there is such an institution, which is rather basic. And so I did a lot of local work, being on boards and committees, and that way people understand that there is a human being attached to USD, the little school on the hill. I also was active in several national organizations, the Independent College Association, the Catholic College and University Association, for example. That way people in higher education become aware that there is another institution, and they learn through me or through whoever is representing us a little bit more about it, hopefully learn to respect it and what it's doing and how it's growing. I think in addition to that, locally people identify the university with the people who are its directors. I didn't fully appreciate that when I came. I knew who the board was, and that's about the size of it. But I learned quickly that having prestigious people on the board of trustees is a kind of imprimatur of its own. Certainly the bishop being the chair gave it the Catholic identity and his unofficial imprimatur. Other priests on the board, having Religious of the Sacred Heart, went back then to that community. Then having lay people on the board who were well known in the community, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, that following Vatican II, we were open to students of all backgrounds, and that was reflected in the fact that our faculty, our staff, and our board represented different faiths. And that seemed to be successful in what we were doing. Our relationship to the other colleges and universities was fairly automatic. I got to know the presidents or chancellor of the University of California, San Diego State University, the community colleges, largely through a social meeting that we had that began with an invitation from the chancellor at the University of California that we, the presidents, meet from time to time. And it was a social interaction. We talked about the problems that each institution was having. For example, I remember very clearly one of the first problems that we faced as a group was the intent of the legislature in denying the University of California a major library, which seems so obvious to those of us who are in higher education that we first couldn't believe that the legislature would consider that. And when we queried them about it, they simply said, well, there's one in Los Angeles. Well, we aren't Los Angeles, and the proximity is not really reasonable. So I think to an individual, all of the college and community college presidents got online with our representatives and pretty much hounded them that that kind of legislation was inappropriate, that UCSD has a right to have whatever it takes to be a major university, which obviously it has become. And can you imagine it today if it didn't have its own library? And there were other instances of that. We talked about salaries, and we talked a lot about transfer students between community college particularly and the four-year institutions. At that time, Point Loma College was still not Point Loma College, and they were having difficulty with identification as we were. So it sort of helped cement this idea that we are all here. Some of us are private, some of us are public, some of us are research universities, a research university. And then state became that with Tom Day's leadership. It really became much more than just a typical state college. It is doing a major job in research itself. So there was this give, take, understand problems, and largely through the social interaction that took place at the campus home up at UCSD. Then problems occurred up there for some reason or other, and they began meeting here. And we met in my office for a number of years. I don't know if it continues or not, but it was very helpful initially in making ourselves known locally and then nationally through our, not only my participation, but other representatives. Sister Sally Fury was on several national boards. Jack Boyce was in the financial NACUBO, which is the National College Business Officers Organization, and so on. The need for campus diversity was obvious, particularly following the 1960s when the civil rights movement called to our attention the fact that there are terribly underrepresented people at the colleges and universities. In examining what was happening here, we knew that we should have many more students, particularly of Mexican-American background, because of their share of the population. To a lesser extent, but still equally important, was the black population, and then beyond that, the Asian population. We set about trying to increase the faculty and staff with increased numbers of people representative of those population groups and of the student body. Somewhere in the late 1970s, we received a major grant from the Irvine Foundation, which enabled us to increase the financial aid very significantly for minority students. And for a private institution, one of the biggest barriers was money. That they're looking at a price tag way above the price of a state-supported or locally supported community college. So that gave us a leg up, and we used that money. It took several years to get it balanced, but our minority population grew from about 7% to almost 29% over the period of time that we were able to increase financial aid through the use of the Irvine grant. When the grant ran out, as you might expect, we had to cut back, and so did the enrollment drop. And I don't know what's happened since then. I would guess that there are enough programs out there now that funds can be made available to support minority action. It's a difficult problem because college tuition, private college tuition has always been more expensive than public. The price tag is higher, the cost to the institutions is the same. So you have that difference. When we realized that the overall enrollment of the non-law school portion of the university was becoming imbalanced, female to male enrollment, meaning that we were receiving many more acceptable applications from women than we were from men. We tried to think through who were the populations out there, male populations, from which we could, or for which we could offer incentives. One of the programs was athletics. We knew that having quality athletic programs, we could attract male students. We learned soon after we also had to have quality women's programs, which we did. But one of the programs which surfaced was an ROTC program. Because of the Navy's presence in the San Diego area historically, it seemed appropriate for us to try to have a Navy program, an NROC program, NROTC program. That did two things. One, it attracts bright students. The Navy's very tough on the academic preparation of its officer candidates. And then secondly, in those days it came with a full tuition. So it resolved the male problem somewhat, and also the financial problem that accompanies it. The idea of having an officer training program moved immediately to the Navy because of the importance of the Navy to the San Diego community. However, at that time, ROTC programs were being kicked off campuses, not brought onto campuses. So I inquired, I had a friend, tennis playing friend who was a vice admiral and had, after he left here, moved to become chief of Navy personnel in Washington. So Sister Fury and I made a dinner appointment with him when we were in Washington for a meeting and explained to the admiral that we would like to have an NROTC program. And he was very forthcoming. He said, look, the Navy has been kicked off campuses, and right now we're not really looking for new ROTC and NROTC unit. But if that system should change, I know you folks, I know the University of San Diego, and I would be delighted to recommend that it be studied as a site. Then, coincidentally, following that experience, there were two people in the law school who were on President Reagan's staff. One was an undersecretary of the Navy, the other was the president's counselor. So I called the person who was with the Navy Department and explained that we had wanted to have a Navy ROTC unit, and he seemed a little bit surprised. He said, well, that's terrific. Well, let's see if we can't do something. The next day, the Secretary of the Navy called me and said, I understand that you'd like to have an NROTC unit. And I said, yes. He said, okay, we'll do that. I was taken aback. Nothing had been cleared with the faculty. And that program comes with curricular implications, obviously, and faculty implications. So I had to explain to the faculty that I had given the go-ahead for this, and that while I hadn't had time to contact them, it was a fait accompli. I had said, yes, we will accept a unit. Well, there were several ex-Navy people on the faculty who championed this cause very articulately, and there were a few who thought that I was being high-handed, which I was, but by the same token, it did exactly what we wanted it to do. Not only the things I've mentioned, the fact that they were top flight students coming in, and that their tuition was taken care of, but that we also had built a relationship with SDSU and UC, because their students were welcome to come to the NROTC program if the Navy were their interest, and if ours were Air Force, they were able to go to state, and so on. So it worked in terms of articulation between the campuses, as well as helping build highly qualified young men and women on the Navy's NROTC program. USD had, from my beginning of my tenure here, a budget committee, and that budget committee changed in membership and in size over the 24-year period. But essentially, it said that it's two phases. The first phase is to have Representatives of each department, the department chairs, the deans, meet and put their budget requests forward. Not just the academic, but all of the non-academic as well. Usually that amounted to a budget about 3 times the size that we were going to be able to afford. So the hard work then began. In order to get through the hard part of that, the budget committee then was reduced in size, and it was reduced to department chairs and deans and heads of non-academic units. So it went from a large-scale operation where everybody knew everybody else's problem to a small decision-making group. I did not meet with that group purposely. Initially, I thought they would never come to an agreement on what they were supposed to do, so I would be responsible for making the final decision. So I didn't want my voice interjected in the give-take process. I was wrong. At that time, 4 vice presidents did the negotiation and the balancing of requests themselves. So by the time I got the budget, the 4 vice presidents agreed upon it. And if they didn't agree upon it, if there was a difference between student affairs and academic affairs, Sister Fury and Tom Burke would get together and work it out. That was very welcome by me. The fact that you have to actually get together and knock heads together to come to resolution of these areas is difficult. And I never had to do that. It was done when I was presented the budget that was representative of the whole institution. It was because the whole institution, through the vice presidents, had agreed on it. I don't know how that process works today. It was workable because of the personalities involved. It was workable because I think that there was a deep understanding between the units of the campus of the needs of others, so that no one was just blown off, as it were. They were seriously considered. USD's campus had an initial architectural statement, which is it's the Plateresque style of Spanish architecture. And my wife and I were both really overcome with the beauty of the place when we arrived here. When we planned our first fundraising program, it included 2 buildings. One was what is now called the Manchester Center, which was to be a continuing education center or conference center. The second was the business school building. In order to do those 2 buildings, we had to bring in architects and so on. And I think that the story that probably got around was that when we were talking to one of our local architectural firms about the conference center building, he came in the office with his staff, and he talked about his ideas for the interior layout of the conference center. And I said, well, how you can do whatever you want to inside the building that meet the requirements of the people who have to work there. But I'll tell you right now, it better look like everything else that's up here. Well, that story got around apparently because there was never any argument when I met with architects after that if you're going to build it at USD, it better look like everything else up here or it won't go. And I believe that very strongly, that the original architectural statement was a thing of its own, and to deviate from that, to mix in colonial or to mix in modern, would have really lost the beauty of the effect of that architecture. And as you can see, the architects have used their imagination really vigorously in creating new statements with that architectural statement. So it was fun to watch it grow. I think it is just as beautiful as when we arrived.